Persona 3 is a game with problems. It has structural issues, too much repetition, and in a lot of ways serves more as a template for a formula that would later be refined with Persona 4 and 5. But despite this, it's still an incredibly unique experience that pushes past its problems and becomes a genuinely great game. Its expansion episode Aigis, in contrast, is basically just a collection of flaws without a lot of the redeeming factors. And yet I can't help but find myself defending it, because one of Persona 3's biggest problems is one that's impossible for the rest of the game to salvage. And despite being generally lower quality, episode Aigis is a necessary evil to fix it. This video will be a bit different from others I've made. As you may have noticed, focusing on more heavily edited content means I don't get to post very often, so in between those videos I'm gonna do stuff like this, which will be less edited and more just talking about video games. If you're new to the channel, I recommend you check out my other videos, which are more in-depth and high effort, including a full review on Persona 3 Reload that I'll include in the description. Episode Aigis is a remake of the original Persona 3 expansion of the same name, included with its FES re-release. Although this is moderately confusing because the expansion was called The Answer in the West. While it isn't a standalone expansion commercially, as it requires the original game, it mostly functions as one, being a separate campaign that has no shared progression with the main game. It serves as an epilogue to the events of Persona 3 and its remake, while providing confirmation on a few of the vaguer elements of the original ending. It follows Aigis and the rest of the party processing the events of that ending while exploring a series of mysterious doors that popped up beneath their dorm room. Before we go any further, we should establish that episode Aigis is not particularly well regarded by people when compared to the main game. There's a lot of reasons for this, but let's illustrate the main one. My playthrough took around 26 hours, represented here by this bar. I'm going to highlight the areas of that playthrough which represent meaningful story content. After a short intro, the game essentially just contains about 25 hours of unrelated dungeon crawling before you get to the ending. There are short scenes at the end of each door, but they don't really add anything that isn't already established by the main game. There's also a few optional dorm events added in the remake that are pretty insubstantial and feel kind of out of place. There's a massive disconnect between story and gameplay here, one that is impossible to ignore. While you could certainly argue that the actual content of the story itself is fine, the way it's told is completely inexcusable, and understandably caused the reputation of the expansion to sour. I want to point this out at the start because while this is going to be a somewhat lukewarm defense of the story in the DLC, at no point am I going to argue that the DLC itself is good. It wasn't good back in 2008, and the minor improvements don't do enough to make it good now. I'd go so far as to say I'm tremendously disappointed they didn't take the basic story and change the wrapper or format in some way. It was likely never going to be worth that effort budget-wise, but that doesn't mean I can't criticize the product on offer here. This is a very rare case where I don't think there's a major difference between playing this expansion story or just watching the cutscenes on YouTube, outside of the fact that you'll save about 25 hours of dungeon crawling with no major combat additions when compared to the base game. The rest of this video is going to be almost exclusively talking about the story because it's what I personally find the most interesting. But if you're looking for a recommendation or breakdown, I wouldn't suggest that anyone pay money for this. I don't even feel the need to talk about the gameplay because it's exactly the same as Persona 3 Reload. That review is in the description for people that haven't played it, and those who have should know exactly what to expect. Let's talk about the ending to the main game. After a bunch of Persona-style high school shenanigans, the party eventually finds themselves in a situation where they're facing the impending end of the world, with the choice to fight against inevitability or wipe their own memories so they can spend their last days blissfully unaware of what's to come. They of course choose to fight, with the protagonist doing some standard anime power of friendship stuff to defeat the literal avatar of death. After this point, the characters start to forget the events of the game. As they approach graduation, they slowly start to remember, culminating in them collectively remembering their adventures on graduation day. They go to find Aigis and the protagonist on the roof, and as the party bursts through the roof doors, the protagonist slowly and peacefully drifts off to sleep. It's known now that this moment is in fact the main character's death. During his anime power of friendship moment, he sacrificed himself, with his spirit hanging on to honor a promise between the members of SEES to meet up on graduation day if they lost their memories. And this might be a bit of an unpopular opinion, but I really dislike this ending. Persona 3 is a game hyper-focused on the theme of death. Basically everything in the game revolves around it, with social links and events of the story exploring it from multiple different angles. Despite the morbid themes though, I think it's a game with an overall positive message. While there are a lot of conclusions to be drawn here, I think the main message is to embrace the concept of death and use it as motivation to live a fulfilling life. It's not really subtle about this either. Here's a bunch of lyrics from the soundtrack supporting this, with this one being the most direct. In the song aptly named Full Moon, Full Life, again, not exactly vague, one of the lines states trepidation doesn't stop death, but it stops life. The other side of Memento Mori is Memento Vivere. Remember that you will die, remember that you will live. In this sense, the ending to Persona 3 is only halfway complete. It's a fantastic ending to the protagonist's story, having used his time to make as many connections as possible before facing death bravely. But for all of the other characters, it sucks. They're left with a confusing tragedy, one whose point and significance they don't understand. You could argue that it's a game about death, and death is sometimes pointless, but it's not really the note the game should leave off on given what I think the major message is. The ending doesn't need to show us the rest of their lives, as in general you should probably leave as much up to the player's imagination as you can, but it should at least leave them in a position to look forward, which I don't think it does. And so, episode Aigis, the unfortunately necessary epilogue to add that little bit of context and elaboration the original ending was missing. And that's what episode Aigis is generally about. The main story is mostly about the party processing the protagonist's death as they go through the stages of grief and emerge with a determination to live better lives. I can almost just leave that as a summary, but for the sake of being thorough, let's talk about the events of the DLC. As the group struggles to work past the ending of the original game, they begin to drift apart. Aigis especially has completely shut herself away and plans to leave the rest of the group as they go through their final year of school. At their final gathering as a group, time appears to stop, and a gigantic staircase shows up in the floor. Another android claiming to be Aigis' sister shows up and attacks the group due to a misunderstanding. She then reveals herself to be a hypersimp who will do whatever Aigis tells her to do. The android named Metis introduces them to a desert beneath the dorm filled with doors, which is as good a clue as any as to how they can restart time. In the process of exploring, they constantly see a shadowy figure who is very obviously the protagonist, but who runs away before they can see him. And that's about as much story as you get until the end of the DLC. As I said earlier, there's some character stuff in between, but it's all oddly unimportant. In some sense, these scenes tie back to their determination to move forward, but it's a pretty tenuous link. More than anything, it's just kind of filler. It's the bare minimum they could have added to try and make the story paced in any reasonable way, but it's nowhere near enough. Flash forward 25 hours, and the group is left with a choice on how to escape the time loop. They can either move forward or step back permanently into the past to a point where the protagonist is still alive, but in which the cataclysm he sacrificed himself to resolve is still very much impending. They disagree on how to move forward, as they all find themselves confused and unsure on if they can bring themselves to move on. They solve these conflicts through anime fights before being gifted a glimpse into the past where they see the truth of the protagonist's sacrifice and gain much needed closure. They then resolve to move forward, and their futures are left open-ended. You can kind of see how it fills in the gaps the original ending left. It reinforces the main message of the game for the entire party and not just the protagonist. And most importantly, it does so without giving too much information on specifics. We don't need to know exactly how people live the rest of their lives because that's for the most part irrelevant. A more haphazard ending would have done unnecessary flash forwards to their future selves, which doesn't happen until it randomly gets put into a Persona 4 fighting game spin-off because Atlus makes bad decisions. Seeing the unique ways in which each character approaches their grief adds a lot to their stories. Yes, the characters can be annoying and unlikable here, but that's sort of the point. This is a dark time for them, and they're kids who don't have any idea on how to deal with this sort of tragedy. There's a lot of misdirected anger and pointless conflict as they waver between depression and indignation. And seeing this stuff is a lot more potent than imagining it when the end goal is not highlighting the grief itself, but the determination that follows it. This is most notably highlighted with Aigis herself. I originally was a bit confused with her as a replacement protagonist. In another opinion that likely goes contrary to most of the community, I don't really feel like Aigis is anything special as a character in the main game. The idea of an android slowly gaining humanity isn't exactly original, and I don't feel like there was anything really unique done to differentiate her from the trope. But it makes quite a bit of sense for her to be impacted the most by the protagonist's death. Her newer humanity is a lot more fragile than the rest of the party. Breaking her down so she can build herself back up is the most direct representation of the grieving process here. This is probably where the format and pacing of the game is most frustrating. Having her work through regaining her sense of self naturally over the course of the expansion would have been fantastic. Instead, her development is relegated to the beginning and ending with very little in between. Still, she's a more compelling character here as an avatar for processing loss than she is in the base game, and Dawn Bennett does a fantastic job voicing her. I'm a big fan of endings which leave a lot of stuff up to the player's imagination. Xenoblade 3 and Final Fantasy 16 are two recent examples that also rank as some of my favorite video game endings in recent years. But it's a difficult sort of ending to pull off. In my opinion, the original ending of Persona 3 leads the player to imagine the wrong sort of thing. It's a positive ending that appears negative when you try to dig into it. And so I think the concept behind episode Aigis is great, and I'd argue the entire Persona 3 experience feels a little incomplete without it. I just wish 95% of it wasn't an unrelated waste of time. Thanks for watching. Like I said, this was a bit of a simpler video while I work on another project. Probably the biggest time sink for me is sorting through the dozens of hours of footage of each game, so I figured I'd cut that out for these shorter videos. This is why footage on the screen didn't always reflect what I was talking about. As I mentioned, there's only around 2 hours of story content actually in the game, so I don't think it warranted a really in-depth approach. I'm working on a video about Visions of Mana and plan to make videos on Metaphor and East 10 as well.